So welcome back from lunch, everyone. Hope everyone had a good lunch. Now on to the final panel session of the day in the nodes track, from semantics and SEO to knowledge graphs and back again. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Just nod? Yeah, great. Okay, great. Okay. I'm David Amerland. I do a lot of things in search and marketing, and today we are sort of moderating the panel. We have some fantastic guys here who have conceptual, high-level conceptual stuff of search and knowledge graph and ontology. And what I'm hoping we'll do today is actually find all the bridging points between the high conceptual stuff and the difficult technical stuff and the everyday things that you need to do in order to make it work for search. So we'll cover this with 5 questions. 2 of them are a little bit conceptual, 3 of them are very practical. As we cover each question, if there is anything that pops into your head in terms of questions, just raise your hand and wave it about wildly, and we'll bring the question into the panel. Is that okay? Just nod, say yes. Thank you. Okay, great. So let's start with a brief introduction. We go from my left. We have Panos Alexopoulos. He's head of ontology at TextKernel, and most of you are probably familiar with ontologies and the concepts and challenges which ontologists face, and we'll get some of that as he tells us about it. Then we have Jono, futurologist and full-stack developer, and then there's Andrea Volpini, who's the CEO of WordLift. All right, we're going to start with the first question. First question is fairly straightforward, we think. Does SEO and digital marketing today really need knowledge graphs? Now, if it does, why? And if it does, and the answer to that is yes, then are knowledge graphs the low-hanging fruit or are they a high-level entry point? So we're going to start off with Andrea. Do you want to tackle this, please?
Yeah, I mean, SEO needs knowledge graph, yeah, 100%, no question about it. There is a lot of value that was very hard to demonstrate back in 2011 when I got started with adding Schema markup and trying to sell the idea that it was useful for businesses. Right now that's easy to be demonstrated, but I think that the real value is really in understanding how open data it's part of your marketing workflow, and that's I think we're still in the process of it. You good?
Does anybody have any questions on that? Is that fairly well understood, or do you need more clarification? Yes? I'll get it to you.
So one thing that's confusing me when I'm thinking of SEO and knowledge graphs together is that SEO is usually, so I've usually heard the term SEO for content creators, blogs, etc., and they're trying to be discovered as easily as possible. But those people, like blog writers and creators, they don't work with knowledge graphs. So how do these people actually leverage knowledge graphs for their SEO needs? And if you're talking about somebody else who does this, so give me an example of who is using knowledge graphs and coming into SEO. Yeah, I'd love to hear more.
Brilliant question, thank you.
I mean, I created a company for that, so we're a good match. So we started the company after experimenting with schema and linked data, and we come from CMS, open data world, linked data world, and then all of a sudden SEO was a thing. We were building a semantic editor, and then all of a sudden we discovered that people wanted semantics for SEO. So the goal that WordLift has is to help any blogger create a knowledge graph. And then your question is correct. And why do a blogger needs a knowledge graph? And that's when I come back to the idea of open data, because you want to express your point of view in a data world. So as we transition from web pages to data, we want to provide everyone with the ability to control the data, because the data now is processed not only by a search engine, but it's processed also by a social network, it's processed by personal digital assistant, and whatever. So the problem is that democratizing this technology, it's an urgent issue, and I'm very happy that we're not alone. When we started, we were alone. Now, Yoast is putting an enormous effort in making this super simple to think about managing pages and managing data at the same time.
Yeah, or even further, to not have to think about it at all. Like one of the things we've known for years is that this stuff is complicated for the average user, for the average blogger. And if you ask them to start thinking about it, it's scary, it's complicated, maintaining it's hard. So a lot of what we've done is said, how do we build the most comprehensive, robust, interconnected thing we can without them even knowing or necessarily caring? We've got now circa 7 million sites running enormously complex knowledge graphs, and I would bet that 6.9 million other users will never even know.
Another argument in favor of using knowledge graph is if the content you're producing is highly ambiguous, right? If every keyword you add can be interpreted in more than 1 or 2 ways, then the only way to help any search engine understand, let's say you have a chance for it to understand, you won't necessarily do it, but you have a better chance for that, would be to, instead of tagging it with your own word, to tag it with an existing concept from some knowledge graph.
Yesterday I gave a very simple example of a knowledge panel related to myself. Knowledge panel in Google used to get information from Wikipedia traditionally because it's a reliable source of information. And now Google is driving the information for the knowledge panel from my entity page. And an entity page is just a web page with an RDF entity in the back. And as Jono say, people don't need to know about it. I don't care if people know that we're building a knowledge graph. It's important that they have an understanding of controlling data as part of their daily work.
Brilliant. Any more questions on that? Okay, that's cool. So let's go to the second question. That's even easier to ask and probably harder to answer. How do you get started with knowledge graphs? Is schema.org a good place to start? And if so, what are the pluses and what are the cons? And can we open this on to Jono?
So the lazy answer is install WordPress and Yoast, but I'm compelled to say that. I think the more sensible answer is to assume that most people work in a business context and need commercial motivation, in which case the answer is schema.org, because that's what Google's rewarding. If you want access to the knowledge panels, the shiny things in search results, that's the format they prefer. They still support the other formats, but they're more brittle, they're harder to scale. There are some emerging formats where they only accept JSON-LD and schema.org markup. If you were going to bet on one technology, it would be describe your web pages verbosely with JSON-LD and don't worry about the rest of the stuff. As a starting point, obviously you want to get beyond that, but step one is definitely it's worth doing, and that's the format.
Anybody, do you want to add anything to this? Okay.
The question was about if we can use schema.org. It's not about technical only. It requires to get started with knowledge graphs for semantic SEO is a shift in the mindset that you are not anymore developing a small ontology or a small database for one application that for people that are in the next room and will just, if they have a problem, come to you and complain. But you're building something that you expect to be understood by lots of people and lots of other applications. So you need to be, let's say, educate your people or get to understand that this is about meaning shareability, meaning interoperability, which is a tough thing. So you can try to find the optimal resources, you can check schema.org, but you also need to have a critical mindset and be very careful on that.
That's brilliant, and I think that also bridges the ability that every time you make a choice in terms of the content that you actually create, that choice has to have a direction in terms of what you're trying to achieve with it. Any more questions on this subject before we move to the next question? Yes?
You're safe, I'm not going to ask a question. I was just going to add a comment that I've picked up along the way that answers that particular question, and that is stop thinking about web pages and start thinking about the things that you are describing. You need that as a start point. Then you can worry about the vocabulary like schema.org or whatever, and then how you share it. But it's things, not strings, to quote Google from 2011.
Pages are an artifact of yesterday's web.
The whole web is moving beyond the concept of pages. We now have rich JavaScript apps which have states and views and transverse fluidity. If you're still thinking about write this web page about this thing, you're kind of missing the point. We need to be building knowledge graphs that also exposes content that also tie to schema.org.
Do crawlers and search engines
engines and data indexers, do they support reading these JavaScript applications and reading knowledge graphs instead of just scrolling the text?
Ish.
I think there are a lot of examples, and I think that most of the time we spend by looking at Google, and we should start looking at also what others do. I think Bing does a terrific job in rendering knowledge graph data. Sometimes it's messy because, of course, it's faster in creating facts, but you can see that you have now some level of control when you start, publishing the same data across multiple pages, and then this kind of solidifies into a fact into this graph. Of course, we have also worked recently to add a property into Wikidata ontology in order to have a link back from Wikidata to resources that user create with WordLift, because of course we want to have consistency and we want to help people understand the data not only from the Google Knowledge Graph perspective, but in a more open linked data type of world.
Thank you. And I think just to add an extra layer to this, when your mindset is changing, a lot of the times I know from a blogger's point of view, you tend to have metrics trying to gauge success of your writing and the page. And you're thinking of terms of page views and visitors to a page, because that's usually the only tools we have to measure that. And that's limiting in itself. So I think you need to keep this in mind as you move forward and as you create that kind of content. All right, so let's go to the third question. It's a little bit more technical and specifically for developers. And we say, how much of a knowledge graph background or a schema.org specifics background is it enough to start using JSON-LD? And what are the benefits in doing so? So can we open this up to...
It's an interesting question. I think it's incredibly easy to get started. Like JSON-LD is a pretty straightforward language and structure. There are many, many examples on the web, on schema.org and on 1001 blogs where you can copy, paste, adapt. I think the getting started bit is easy. Starting to transform that and build it into a more connected graph is much harder. And if you saw my talk earlier, that's a lot of what I've spent my time doing, is trying to work out how do you systematically do that, how do you build the vocabulary, the complexity of saying, it's very easy to say I have a recipe. It's very hard to say I have a recipe that's written by this person who works for this organisation, which is on this website, yada, yada, yada. That bit's hard, and there aren't any good resources out there other than trial and error. And I know a lot of people in this room kind of build on each other's work, and that's really the only way we've got as far as we're going. And the formats are still evolving. The standards are changing, there are new things coming and going. We're working this out as we go. So get started, play, and then ask questions in rooms like this.
And to add to this, I think that it's important that we look at the use case, because some use cases are whatever is into Bing or Google guidelines for rich snippet. That's a starting point. So a recipe, I get a rich snippet, I want to start there. But the reality is that when you start building data and you start thinking about things and not strings, then you get an enormous advantage in using this data yourself. And so you have to think about it and say, okay, how am I going to use this data that I'm providing? Because some data will be for others to know you and to access the site, in different ways, but some of the data might be for you to understand the traffic beyond the web pages, for instance. As David was saying, this is extremely important. Right now we provide, data into Google Analytics to help people see the traffic by entity, not by pages. Because a page, what is a page? If I'm talking about structured data on 45 pages, is my traffic about each page, or it's a combination of it, or should I read the metrics in a different way? So this is the way that then you kind of evolve forward, the basic.
Anybody else has a question on this? No? Okay. Okay, fourth question. I'm going to go one more to go after that. And this is an easy one. What if we go the other way around? What if we start with a knowledge graph? For those of you who already have built a knowledge graph, is there a reason and a way to use it so we can enhance SEO? And how would that work in practice? So can we start with Andrea?
So my suggestion is always to get a quick win, because when you get started, you want to show the management or whoever, the client, that there is an impact. And the simplest way to measure an impact nowadays is by looking at impressions and click-through rates. And you can get impression by describing content, regardless of if there is a support for that specific schema class or not. Because usually a search engine will understand more the content and will be able to provide more traffic. So impression usually tend to go high. And then the second part, of course, is to focus on, okay, is there a rich snippet there that I can tap on? Because if I can tap that, I want to get that. Then, of course, there are cases where getting a rich snippet might decrease the number of clicks. And so you have to think carefully about, where you want to draw the line and how much content you want to make available. And that's also the beauty of structured data or structured link data, is that you are in control of whatever data other can use.
Nice. I think the other thing worth mentioning is that all the schema.org framework is extensible, and that if you operate in a business that doesn't have well-defined schema, for example, car manufacturing, no, they have really well-defined schema. Pets, we were talking about animals earlier. If you work in the pet industry, there is no good schema.org structure and definition for what is the relationship between animals and their food and their care, and loads of stuff about vets, bizarrely. You can define that. And you might need some back and forth, there might be some politics, but there's a chicken and egg problem otherwise, where Google are never going to support rich snippets for pet-based information because there's no schema.org markup. So until somebody puts the hard work in to do that, you don't create those markets. And there's potentially huge reward for getting there first and being the thought leader in defining those standards. And all you do is you go and write the spec, argue about it with him for a bit, and hopefully it becomes real.
So adding to what Andrea said, if you have a knowledge graph, of course, it makes sense to use it. You have, though, to be careful whether your knowledge graph is actually optimized for SEO. So usually we build knowledge graphs for 1 or 2 applications in our organization, and we put their biases and assumptions that are applied only to this. So it may be that if you just put the knowledge graph, as plug and play for SEO, it may not do the trick. So doing an A/B analysis or some kind of metric based, and then act upon it, right? Maybe adding concept, changing relations, adding lexicalizations can really give you a difference. Otherwise, it may be that just you plug it there and there's no positive impact whatsoever.
There's one more thing to consider. If you're looking at how do I A/B test and validate whether this is valuable, a lot of what you'll see when you start really getting invested in schema and getting structured markup, and Google start displaying those rich snippets, is fewer people might visit your website because their needs have been met in the search results. Like Google extracted the answer and served it to them there. And that's a great experience for the user, it's a great brand building moment, but all of your conventional analytics and measurement will show that it worked worse. You'll really need to think about what does success look like for serving users in different ways in different places, rather than just going this decreased traffic.
Thank you. And again, what a hugely important point, because again, it leads to the mindset. And I think the mindset, in order to change, the perception of what we're doing needs to change, which means we need to grasp what's changing in terms of the reality which we're actually dealing with. And that's usually the hardest thing of all. Okay, we go, on that note, we go towards the last question, which is more sort of abstract, and it has to do with the evolution of schema.org. So how would that evolve? Can we start with Panos, please? No? No? No?
That's for sure. Depends on you. Depends on the community. I mean, depends on the use cases, really. I think that what we were discussing before with Richard is really that now we are in a position, and it's a time where we need more engagement from people from outside of the search engine world into the content space to understand how this can be moved forward.
I spend a lot of time trying to debug awkward technical issues with how Google's interpreting bits of schema, and I Google around a lot, and I find Stack Overflow conversations and Reddit conversations that dried up in 2015, and there's nothing since, because Google are busy elsewhere and the other players aren't involved. Again, it comes down to all of us. If we want to change these standards, we want to evolve it, we want to support new things, go contribute. And we can change the rules, we can extend them. Otherwise, it is what it is, and it's just going to be... Yeah, we're going to do pets. But otherwise, what's happening now is Google are unilaterally making bad decisions. Not actively bad, but they're making a mess. They've got different teams pulling in different directions. We were saying just now, they've just deprecated a whole bunch of stuff that they spent years scoping in the early days of how things like interaction should work. They're going to keep making a mess, and there's nobody really contesting that at the moment, so it's down to us.
So indeed, it's pretty much a matter of governance and incentives and motivations. Apart from Google and Schema.org, there is a whole, maybe you know, the Link Data Cloud, right, with Wikipedia and many other resources. And pretty easy to see how much of it is actually not dead, but let's say stale, right? Something that hasn't been updated for a while. There have been many efforts in creating ontologies. And I see that every day when I'm trying, as part of my work at TextKernel, to reuse ontologies and leak data sets that are out there and are supposed to be free and available, and I see that apart from quality issues, I can see most of them have been abandoned. So yeah, again, I agree with Jono and Andrea. That's a matter of incentives.
Okay. I'm going to look now for a few shortcuts from everything we just discussed in terms of practicalities. So if you're an average blogger with an average knowledge of JSON-LD, an average understanding of knowledge graphs, and a zero understanding of ontologies, how would you start putting all this together in a couple of words? Can you start with Andrea?
I think if you're a blogger, you have to focus on content. There's nothing that you can do other than understanding, what are the things that matter the most for your content. And that's the biggest challenge, because in order to understand how you can use an ontology, you have to understand, okay, what are the nodes that you're pointing to, and what is revolving around your content. So for me, the question is start from the content and move from there to bigger ontologies and use cases.
I'm paid to tell you to get on WordPress and install Yoast SEO, but even that aside, this has been my life for the last year and a half, has been how do we build software where, for exactly those kinds of people where you don't have to think about it, you literally install it and it just happens. Yeah, so also this is not just WordPress, it's not just Yoast. If you were in my talk earlier, I talked about we've written an open source standard that should be extensible into other solutions, hoping that people will start building that as well, but yeah, just install the software.
So I'm an ontologist, but I really have no idea how to optimize. If I write a blog, what concepts to put in order to make it SEO compatible. So I would say that if you are in an organization and you want to support your own people, let's say you're in a media organization, you want to support your own people, your own content producers to use that, you need abstraction. You need intuitive user interfaces that will hide all the messy details and complexity of what is underneath. That's one thing. If you're not able to do that, then you need to seek out external solutions. Not necessarily those guys, but you get my point, right?
Any questions on all this? Any questions in terms of practicality, or any questions which you have at the back of your mind, how you apply this in day-to-day life? Hands up, please. No? Yes? Okay.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything like too many tags or too much work on trying to to improve the SEO by adding too many concepts too much to the page, that it can be borderline on the what used to be the keyword stuffing, for instance?
That's a good question over optimization. I think Google recently actually had a few user cases in this.
So there's all sorts of moving parts on that. One is that Google are very strict on thou shalt only represent stuff on the page. If you start marking up structured data about things which aren't literally on the page, they get very upset. There's another interesting point around performance, is that you're adding a lot of kilobytes of weight to the page, and at scale that's an issue. And until we get proper support for CSS selector, there are big parts of Google's documentation, at least, that say, things like a review, you have to put the whole review body into the schema, and then you're duplicating huge amounts of text and content. The one that happened the other day was really interesting, and I think this is the first example of them really working out where these lines are. You can no longer have what they call self-serving reviews of organizations. So historically, you could say, my organization has 5,000 five-star reviews, and here's my TripAdvisor integration that validates that. You can no longer present your own reviews of yourself on your site. Yeah, you can definitely mark it up, but you won't get the reward for it. So we're starting to see examples where they are clamping down on over-optimization. But that aside, definitely don't be guided by the only things they support. Put everything you can in, make it as big as possible, make it as rich as possible, and then the support and the rewards will come. Otherwise we get stuck in that carrot and stick loop.
I mean, I think for me it's always like think in terms of open data. Think in terms of what you can release out to the public in order for whatever machine to create value out of your brand. That's the decision to be made.
Don't put commercially sensitive stuff in there. I had a site that had their e-commerce returns rate for different products as a percentage in their structured data and their schema. And like if I were a competitor sniffing that, they were using it for some really clever analytics stuff and some conditional triggering, but maybe obfuscate anything that's a bit sensitive or leave it out. But other than that, go wild, yeah.
As we finish, one small question. Can we get ready for a post-Google world? Is there such thing?
We've been working for years for that. So I mean, I think we already are there. I mean, in a way, today, if you look at if you just try to analyze the logs on a web server, you see that this JSON-LD is not processed by Google alone. Not at all. I mean, there's a lot of competition or crawlers or different search engines that are using this data. And I think that enabling the data and working on the community that define how we write data, it's a major step forward. A non-Google world. Which I mean, nothing against Google, of course, we live with Google. So, but I think in a more open society, we can kind of think outside of the actual experience.
When I talk with SEOs about structured data and schema, they are consistently terrified about Google's going to take my data. I don't want to expose all this. I don't want to tell them everything. They're going to take my users. But in order to get to that world where we enable new services and new types of systems, we have to have that data exposed. And when that's there and it's consistent and it's populated across the web, it becomes so easy to build things which aren't Google. But we can't do that until we have it. So we're stuck in this intermediary period where we have to play Google's game because that's the only way you can drive support and adoption to get stuff out there. But when it's done, who knows what happens?
Brilliant. Yes, questions? Yes.
Yeah, just last question. Panos last in your talk earlier, you said the new war is the war over structured data, and you said Amazon were winning the war. Are they going to be a player in this space? We're expecting more from them, from sort of Alexa and so on. Are they going to push out some standards?
So they have a very different approach.
Thank you. Amazon have a very different approach, and obviously it's all within the context of their walled garden. But what we see them doing is incentivizing developers to build applications which they then monitor and assess people's voice interactions with them, the number of times an Alexa device fails to serve a result and what the entity in relation to that was. Incentivize more developers to build apps for that, buy up the successful ones, and just use armies of developers and money to start to turn areas of opportunity based on schema and entities into products that they sell or own. And so you've got this weird thing where Amazon's walled garden is growing exponentially just because they're funding it, and Google's got everything else, but they're just kind of plodding away, hoping that it all gets tied up somehow. It'll be interesting to see where all commerce ends up.
That's brilliant. And with that, we've finished. Please put your hands together for Panos, Jono, and Andrea, everyone. Thank you.